Greetings, good afternoon, welcome everybody. It's great to be back to share an updated, revised, and even expanded Funding Futures report for 2021. COVID-19's upended so many things in our industry and more broadly in the world, but it also provided a unique moment to look at the options and opportunities for a fresh approach to tourism taxation and the funding of destination marketing and management organizations. Welcome everybody, my name is Chris Adams and I am Head of Research and Insights at Miles Partnership. And for the 2021 edition, we put back together the all-star team. So I'm delighted to be joined with our agency friends at Civitas, Tourism Economics and Destination Analysts, and let's welcome in the key people who are going to be presenting today. The wonderful Erin Francis Cummings, a very familiar face, President and CEO of Destination Analysts, guitar maestro and entertainer, in addition to being a wonderful economist and analyst, Adam Sachs, Head of Tourism Economics, and then our co-collaborator and very good friend, John Lambeth, President and CEO of Civitas. So John, I'll pass over to you to acknowledge some of the other contributors to this project, outline the agenda for today, and kick off the first part of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be with you and this distinguished panel. We're so excited about this Funding Futures report. The report that we released last year was a terrific report with lots of information. We got lots of good feedback from that report. And we want to start by saying thank you to the folks that helped make this possible. Destinations Analyst and Destinations International and the Canadian Alliance both supported these efforts, as well as U.S. Travel's Destination Council. We thank all of them, and we thank all of you that took time to fill out the surveys and participate in this study. We decided we wanted to really update this study with some good information for 2021. So we have gone through a process, each of these firms essentially this year on a pro bono basis, updating the outlook for recovery, doing an update on the survey of DMOs, thanks to Destination Analysts, and updating the recovery section because so much has happened now with the passage of ARPA, and all of that is getting rolled in to the new Funding Future study that's going to be released tomorrow. That'll include 10 newer enhanced funding options, and you can see all the cities, states, and provinces that participated in the study. So we're very excited about that coming out. Today's webinar is really giving you some of that same information that will be explored in greater detail in the study. We're going to first talk about an update on the recovery funding. We're going to talk about the survey of DMOs. We're going to talk about the outlook for recovery, the newer enhanced funding options, and finally, takeaway and resources. We've packed a lot into today, so hopefully we can get through all of this and still have time for your questions coming forward. Let's start first by diving into the recovery funding section. And hopefully all of you have heard now about the EDA funding that's out there. There is $3 billion in ARPA put into the EDA. That's twice the amount of last year in the CARES Act that was put into EDA. And very importantly, an important piece of language was put into this legislation, thanks to U.S. Travel and others that really worked hard for this, to say 25% of this $3 billion would be allocated to the tourism industry, or $750 million specifically for travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation. So that $750 million, EDA stepped forward and said, we're going to split that into two pots. $510 million of that is going to be in direct non-competitive grants to states, and $240 million will be in the form of competitive grants. Let me start by talking just for a moment about the state tourism grants. This is, like I said, a non-competitive grant. So these amounts are locked in. They gave notices to all the governors quite a while back, and about 3 weeks ago was the timeline in which the states had to respond back to the EDA and let them know how generally they were going to spend this money and who was going to be in charge of it. Now, I know many state travel offices got called out as part of that process, but we're here today to tell you, really check on that in your state. Make sure you know who's in charge of this money and how it's being allocated, because this is specifically for the tourism industry. And one other unique thing about this pot of money is this can be spent on marketing and promotions. Generally, the EDA doesn't allow it. They're not allowing it in their non-competitive grants, but on these state grants, they are allowing it. And here are all the amounts for each state that they've identified. The EDA used a formula that they're not releasing, of course, but they did use a formula based on how much tourism activity there is in each state and how much the state was affected by COVID. And these are the specific allocations that will go to each state. This is not variable. This is not in question. If the state fills out the paperwork and goes through the process, each state will get the amount that you see here on this table. This will appear in our updated report. If you'd like more information on that, please feel free to reach out to us. As it relates to the competitive grants, these are applications that are open now that you can apply for this competitive money. And who's eligible? Private nonprofit corporations are eligible, state, county, and city organizations are available. So DMOs in general are eligible for these grants, and most I would say many DMOs are actively pursuing grants in this space. How can these competitive monies be used? Well, as we all know, the EDA loves to fund reports, action plans, strategic plans, those kinds of documents. And so many destinations are looking at either a strategic plan or a destination master plan as part of their application process with the EDA. If you need a strategic plan, if you need a destination master plan, boy, this is a great opportunity for you to submit an application to the EDA and potentially get some of that money. This is an 80-20 matching program, so they will pay for only 80% of the total project costs, and there is some bureaucracy associated with it. It takes some work to get through the application process, but if you're thinking about some sort of strategic plan or destination master plan, boy, this is a great opportunity for you to take advantage of it. The second most popular item for DMOs is going to be capital improvements. And the EDA loves to fund long-term capital improvements. They like to see things that physically get built. So we've got everything from building trails to improvements at a convention center to other kinds, signage kinds of programs, other kinds of capital improvements that you want to pursue. Remember, they want to see projects that are mostly shovel ready. So this isn't about projects that are really early in the process. But if you do have a project that has been thought about, you've got some entitlements, and you think you potentially this would fit into this grant proposal, boy, what a great opportunity for you to get some of that money. Here's a list of all the amounts that were allocated by the regional offices within EDA. This is what they have to spend. So you can see here, this is the total amounts. These applications have been open since July. So if you haven't applied yet, boy, it's time to do that. We're quickly approaching the end of the year. There isn't a particular deadline, but when they run out of money, that will be it. And so we're certainly advising folks, if you haven't gotten your application in already, boy, you need to work on getting that done quickly. This is just a recognition of some of the other programs, relief programs that are out there. Airports got a significant infusion of capital. Shuttered venue operators also were taken care of as part of these relief packages, as were restaurants, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. These are all programs that have been done that have helped our industry make it through this process. And finally, economic injury disaster loan. I know most of you are not looking for loans per se, but I wanted to at least highlight that they did increase the amount of this loan from a possible $500,000 to $2 million. It still has a very low interest rate at 2.75%, and they now are allowing you to refinance debt through this loan. They also extended the first payment again, so you've got another year before the first payment would be due. So if a loan does fit where you need to restructure some debt, this is a good option for all of you. And Chris, I'll turn it back to you to talk further about other ARPA funding that's out there.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. So I want to dive into the American Rescue Plan Act, which deals with fiscal recovery funding. So this was the very substantial amount of money that dealt with trying to make states, cities, and counties whole in terms of the impact of COVID-19. It's been estimated that, in fact, this recovery funding amounts to 4 times the impact on budgets. So it's not just making these state and local government entities whole, it's in fact giving them a whole new sort of newfound money. And you can see the amounts there that are very substantial. Now, this is obviously, again, using a formula based on the unemployment rate. Half went out this year, half is going out next year. And so we've got a little bit of time in terms of how the money needs to be spent. And as you'll see later, a lot of this money has not been allocated. So this is being used at the discretion of the governors, the county commissioners, the mayors, the political masters in terms of deciding where and how. There are some broad guidelines. There's some other requirements in terms of how this money needs to be spent. But the starting point is obviously understanding in your state, your city, and your county how much money they received. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking in Nebraska, and you can see just this one county. This is Grand Island, Nebraska. The county around it, Hall County, is getting $11 or $12 million. And you can see on this list, the city's getting a further just over $9 million. So $20 million for the city and surrounding county, and what is by national standards pretty small municipality and surrounding counties. So there's significant opportunity, but obviously tourism needs to be at the table with a proactive plan in terms of why tourism can be a critical and important part of the recovery. Now, the good news is, in the American Rescue Plan Act, hospitality and tourism was specifically mentioned as a critical area of economic recovery and the recovery of jobs. And our good friends at US Travel actually undertook a survey of 114 DMOs. 31 of those respondents came back and said, and this is back in August, that they'd received funding, which included 11 states and about 20 convention visitor bureaus and other DMOs. And the amounts are quite variable. At the top end, the likes of Arizona has received over $70 million from this fiscal recovery funding. Also cities and counties, but it's variable. And just emphasizing that point again, that half the money is going to be coming out next year. So now the Brookings Institute took a close look at 20 US cities, which is perhaps a little sample of what's going on. And the reality is, from their deep dive into those 20 cities, they found that 82% of this fiscal recovery funding has not been allocated or committed yet. So obviously there's a critical opportunity here to be at the table with a proactive plan. Coordinate with your partners in terms of other economic sectors, other agencies, industry, etc., whether it's workforce, for example, or dealing with some of those sort of overarching issues in terms of how tourism can help in the wider community, and focus on some of those themes of building back better in terms of good quality year-round jobs, issues of sustainability, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So significant opportunity there. I'm going to pass over now to our wonderful good friend, Erin Francis Cummings, who is going to share the updated survey of what destinations are saying they're dealing with in October 2021. Over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so more on the current state of funding for DMOs and what we can learn about how to improve the future ahead. My company, Destination Analyst, we are a full-service market research firm. We serve the travel, tourism, and hospitality industries with deep custom insights to ensure that organizational strategies they employ result ultimately in success. We're very, very honored to be part of the Funding Futures Project with our friends at Miles Civitas Tourism Economics, and of course to support our great DMO industry. Our role in this process was undergoing the critical step of asking questions and gathering information from the leaders of destination marketing organizations themselves. We conducted an online survey sent via email invitation. Many of the questions we asked in 2020 in order to be able to track important changes. But of course, we examined topics of new relevancy to tourism funding. In total, we completed surveys from 21 US state tourism offices, 89 American DMOs, and 4 Canadian DMOs. I won't be able to spend our time today getting into heavy detail, but I do have the key takeaways for you, and it is presented broken out by organization type. And I think what you'll see emerge is a story of a lot of responsibility and why a solid, diverse, and even creative funding strategy is more important than ever. So first, we asked about the functions and roles for which destination marketing organizations are responsible. And of the 17 we tested, these are the top 5 by organization type. And we see tourism marketing, destination branding, tourism research and data, and then visitor services through visitor information centers really sit up there for all types of these organizations. State tourism offices have industry training and education as a top responsibility, while over 76% of US DMOs say they are responsible for destination management. Not only are DMO roles and responsibilities diverse and complex, these organizations are undertaking a lot, an average of 6 per state tourism office, a whopping 8.2 for US DMOs and 11.3 for Canadian DMOs. And the pandemic has caused the majority of these organizations to review their primary roles and responsibilities. 57% of state tourism offices have or plan to have done so. 29% said they already did that. 77% of US DMOs reviewing changes to their primary responsibilities, with 29% having already taken that review, and all of the Canadian DMOs that we surveyed. If you thought this meant that they may be shedding some responsibilities because of the pandemic, nope. Over 3/4 are taking an increased role in destination management. Over half are taking an increased role in economic development. Over 1/3 are taking an increased role in the management and marketing of meetings and conventions. So with so many responsibilities and these be increasing, let's look at the areas they are planning to invest in over the next 2 years, specifically on the destination management side. For all these organizations are most commonly engaging and more closely with businesses and industry partners. And following that, state tourism offices are most likely investing in and developing or updating their destination master plan or sustainable tourism strategy. For US DMOs, they are investing in engaging more closely with residents and community groups, and our Canadian DMOs leading the way on resident sentiment research and financially investing in DEI programs. Looking more towards the bottom of this list, so it's not yet a majority, but still many state tourism offices and DMOs are also planning to support community development programs and invest in sustainability initiatives and environmental protection programs. So while this is incredible, as I keep saying, it's a lot. That's a lot of roles and responsibilities and ideas and investments in the future. So making the strategy for funding really, really imperative. So let's take a look at where destination marketing organizations are with funding. Of the Canadian DMO survey, they have an average of 5 funding sources. They have typically been more diverse than US organizations. The average for US DMOs is 3.1. The typical state tourism office only identified 1.8. Now, of course, part of this is the impact of the pandemic. When we asked how many funding sources were lost over the last year, and that's not even including how much funding was reduced, but each of these types of organizations commonly lost at least one funding source. Here are the top 5 funding sources these organizations are reporting. Government recovery funds have become important, as you see here, in addition to traditional government and TOT sources. Many still have the opportunity to expand other revenue sources, for example, like through advertising and sponsorships. Unfortunately, there is some budget optimism, particularly among US DMOs, 61.8% of which said their next budget will be an increased one. Here are the sources of the recovery funds for state tourism offices, largely coming from EDA and federal funding from both last year and the current year. For DMOs, employee pay subsidies and support, as well as from the federal government. So let's look at the state of reserve funds. Just over 40% of state tourism offices are actually working on this. The majority of US DMOs and all the Canadian, though, have or are working on reserve funds, primarily in the up to 6 months range. Few are actually looking at those reserve funds covering more than a year. In terms of the new and more sustainable funding sources being sought, this looks primarily to be focused on TIDs, but also some bed tax collections from short-term rentals and other commercial accommodation. So I'll conclude here today with organizational changes these destination marketing leaders have seen or overseen since 2020. Compared to 2020, nearly all have worked to align with key partners like economic development and other government entities. Even more than in the past, over 80% agree their organization will have a central role in improving tourism, focusing more on sustainability, resident and local business engagement, and more. Compared to 2020, over 3/4 are investing in a greater commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, including training, staffing, working with partners and community groups. But where help may still be needed is in moving forward the development of new and more sustainable sources of funding. So please let this serve as inspiration to you. Should you have any questions on the findings from our survey, know that you can always reach out to me. So I thank you, and I will now hand this over to my friend Adam, who's going to give an update on the outlook for recovery.
Great, thank you, Erin. I'm going to just jump right in. There are a couple of things I want to share with you today. The first is, if I can just make my way to the next slide here. Here we go. The first is this fundamental question of, do TID destinations outperform their peers? And there's a reason that I want to start here, because it addresses the fundamental question of, does destination marketing make a difference? And I think that's a fundamental assumption that we are all making, but we may agree on that amongst ourselves, but I'm hoping to lay the foundation for something that we can use with our stakeholders, with our partners, with third parties, with policymakers, to further make it really stress the point that destination marketing funding makes a difference. And then we'll move from that to look at how we see the funding outlook evolving over the next couple of years. So this question of, do destinations outperform the market, is the way that we've addressed this. And this sort of builds on, any one DMO can do analysis of their economic impact, right? By looking at the incremental effects of their sales and of the incremental effects of their marketing, right? And there are various ways to come at that. And then through that, measure the economic impact of the incremental visitor spending generated by those sales and marketing efforts, and therefore the benefits that are realized by businesses through sales, by households through jobs and income, and through and realized by government in the form of taxes. So this is the basic framework that any one DMO can take. But what we've tried to do, and this was something that John Lambeth and I talked about a couple of years ago, and we were able to pull together a team that brought STR in as well. And we looked at 100 cities, and the goal was, let's test a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that cities that implement a TID, that basically increase their funding, outperform their peers in the years after that increase in funding. Now, you may not have a TID or have any intention of having a TID. This is still relevant, because the only reason that we chose TIDs as the framework here is because Civitas has been tracking the exact date and time and the level of increase of TID funding across cities across the country for many years. So what it allowed us to do is use that data set as a benchmark for a control group against a total of 100 cities. So STR provided monthly data on hotel performance by city. So we looked at 29 TID cities compared to 71 non-TID cities. And so the question is, after a TID was implemented, does a TID city tend to improve its performance, and does it do better than its peers as well? Well, sure enough, they do. And if you look at it in terms of revenue on the left, you can just see visually that TID cities begin to outperform their non-TID city comp sets in kind of around 2010, 2011. And it's pretty much every single year but one, there's a clear, observable outperformance of these TID cities. And net, there's a significant increase over that period of time between these two groups. What we found is in aggregate, before a TID was implemented, these 29 cities underperformed the non-TID cities by just a little bit. They were underperforming by 0.12%. After the TID was formed, they began to outperform and overperform by a third of a percentage point. So that's a gap of about a half a percentage point every single year in performance relative to the competitive set. When we did the same analysis on revenue, we found the divide to be even greater. That is, it was about a 1.1 percentage point growth difference between before they had the TID and then after their funding was increased. So there's something really interesting here that we're beginning to get our minds around, that once these TID, basically once this increase in funding takes place, a change in performance also takes place in that city relative to its competitive set. So we wanted to take it one step further and test for causality, not only look at the difference between before and after, but actually look at causality. And so one of our PhD economists built a really extensive model. That the details of this are available to you in a separate white paper that we're going to be publishing shortly. But what was fascinating about doing that modeling, where we basically controlled for all of the variables to try to identify, could we see that change in funding as a major explanatory variable in the performance of that destination relative to its competitive set? That's the question. And in fact, it was a hugely explanatory variable to the point of an R squared of 0.99. That is, it explained nearly 100% of the variability in performance between before and after that period of time of when funding took place. And so the effect of that is that hotel demand in an average TID city experienced a lift of 2.1% in hotel room demand and a 4.5% lift in room revenue. So this is fairly technical and it's high level, but it's another kind of tool in the toolkit in terms of, I think, DMOs broadly being able to make a case for funding makes a difference. And it's clearly made a difference historically when we've looked at these 100 cities and changes in funding that's taken place across these 100 cities. All right, so where do we think this is all going in terms of funding? I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights. First of all, to note that actually travel has been holding steady as we move to the fall. So air travel, air passenger volume, still hovering around 80% of 2019 levels. That's the same as it was in July. And so even with the shift somewhat from a predominantly leisure to a mixed business and leisure market, we're still seeing that strength. And occupancy according to STR is holding at around 6 percentage points below 2019 levels. So hotel performance has been better than air travel performance, where air travel is down about 20, occupancy down about 6 percentage points. But the big variability, of course, is weekday and weekend still, reflecting the difference of business versus leisure demand. You can see that on the left, weekday performance is still around that 80% of 2019 levels week after week, but weekend is getting awfully close to those 2019 benchmarks on the weekends. So clearly that leisure market is still driving things. Longwoods is showing continued encouraging data on intentions to travel. The data released this morning showed an increase in intentions to travel among U.S. households. In the next 6 months, 9 in 10, 91% plan to travel in the next 6 months. And I'm not surprised because the economic data support this. Household net worth has shot up to over $130 trillion over the last year and a half, and debt service has fallen over the same period of time among households. So balance sheets are in a really good spot. Households are experiencing sort of the backside of pent-up demand. And so all of that we're seeing that in the data. And DMOs are playing a really important part in this. When we aggregate data across DMO websites, we can see that starting in the spring of this year, website activity at DMO sites was higher than 2019 in every single month, every single week. And so clearly travelers are going to DMOs as a means of planning and booking their trips. On the group side, that's where we're going to have to wait a little bit longer. Right now, group room demand is at around 60% of 2019 levels. So there's a bit of a ways to go. Business travel, we saw a bit of a pause with the Delta variant, but that seems to be turning into renewed travel intentions. Right now, about 2/3 of businesses in the US are traveling right now, according to GPTA. And Interestingly, while we saw a big drop in those who weren't traveling that intended to start traveling in the next 3 months, in September, we've seen a big uptick in October. Now 42% of businesses planning to start traveling in the next 3 months among those that are not currently traveling. And aggregating group room nights across Simple View CRM users, we also see group room nights beginning to show the pace recovering as we move into 2022. If you just focus on Q2 with me, you'll see that in the latest data, we're off about 11% in terms of the pace of what's on the books relative to the same period in 2019. So we can imagine a world in 2022 where a group begins to get in the range of that sort of maybe 15 to 20% below 2019 levels. So depending on your mix of group, transient, and leisure, these things are going to greatly influence your individual performance. Here's my final slide for you. The big difference between this downturn and the past two, there are two of them actually. One is that, of course, this downturn was much, much sharper. The second is that the recovery period is going to be significantly shorter. And this is remarkable indeed. Each of the last two downturns in terms of revenue per available room took 5 years to fully recover. One of the reasons it took so long is because average daily rate fell so far and took so long to come back. We're already seeing ADR back in most markets, and nationally it is back. And so that is shortening the time frame of this recovery, where we expect it to be only 3 years and really back to where we're nationally in terms of hotel room revenue by the end of next year. And so that's an impressive comeback, especially given the extent of the losses. So thank you very much. I'm going to now give this back to my friend John.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. And boy, your contributions to the industry just are so appreciated. It's so helpful to have not only your outlook, but your analysis of how those models are working. We're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive now into some of the dedicated funding models that are out there that folks are taking advantage of, and what some of the new developments in those models are. And I love starting a discussion like this with a discussion of funding in general for bureaus. And we've done a lot of research in this space, looking at both public and private funding. And I think most of these private funding sources you all recognize. On the public side, of course, we've got grants and we've got tax allocations, whether they are linked to bed tax or linked to gaming revenues or linked to sales taxes. We have a whole number of different ways we see those kinds of taxes allocated. I'm going to talk today about these last two, sales tax increment financing and some of the things that are happening in that space, and then assessments. And assessments are key here because they are different in type. Their legal underpinning for that kind of a levy is different. It must be based on benefit back to the payer. And that's what makes tourism improvement districts or tourism recovery districts such a powerful force in our industry. I wanted to highlight that many of our folks around the country that have been so smart about the way they have taken on these projects have said, at a time of recovery, we really should be talking about the use of this money for recovery. And why not use that in the name of the district? In fact, so far to go, maybe even calling it self-help, because that's what these districts are. They levy an assessment on hotels, you collect additional money, and that money goes back to promoting and really benefiting the industry. So we are starting to see more of this all the time, self-help tourism recovery districts to focus on expedited recovery, additional demand, and industry jobs. It really, in terms of some of the points that our clients are making to their local governments, they're really saying, look, this is a very limited ask of government. We're not asking you for more money. We're asking you for the right to put together our own mechanism. Let us do this to come forward and help our industry. These, of course, are scalable. We're seeing some of them now start at one rate and have the ability to climb over time. Community engagement, what an important concept in our industry right now. And this is another great tool for engaging the community. In fact, Adam and I have talked a lot about the various ways of engaging the community. We see TIDs doing this. His work on the data front and really making the DMOs a central point of data is doing that same idea, putting the DMO in a central role within the community and engaging the community in those efforts. Some folks are tying the assessments to a specific date in terms of a point in time in the recovery. And of course, as always, whatever money you spent putting something like this together can be returned to you in the form of paying back the initial costs associated with doing that. Two places I wanted to give a shout out to with respect to using this title, Tourism Recovery Districts. First, in Louisiana, congratulations to Kyle Edmiston and Jill Kidder. Boy, you guys did a fantastic job getting that law passed in the state of Louisiana. It was signed into law in June, and that provides for now the creation of tourism recovery and improvement districts in Louisiana. New York, boy, there's some folks there that are working hard on getting this legislation approved this year. Kristen Reynolds really working hard on this effort along with the team in New York, Patrick Kaler and others, saying we want to get this legislation through, has a bill introduced for tourism recovery and improvement districts. If we look at what's happening across the US, I wanted to share this map. You can see in blue, these are the states that actually have districts now. And I would like to recognize a few folks that have really done some great work in this space. I want to recognize Cynthia in Fort Collins. She just got a district done in Fort Collins, Colorado, successfully putting together a TID that's going to make a big difference in her destination. As we move further east, we can see that there are now districts in Alabama and Tennessee. There's one district in Florida, in Tampa. Pennsylvania has some districts and is running legislation both, which is terrific. I want to give a shout out to my friend Evan Smith in Newport, Discover Newport, Rhode Island, put together a very successful district there and is really doing some great things with that new infusion of capital, as well as Martha Sheridan in Boston. Not only got legislation through in 2021, but got her district done on the East Coast. You can see in yellow all those places that are currently thinking about it. Virginia is a gray color here because Virginia passed legislation. I will give a shout out to Kurt Krause in Norfolk for getting that legislation done in Virginia. But certainly you'll see why the year of 2022, in my estimation, may be the year of TIDs in the Midwest. Look at all those states that are actively working either on legislation or getting a district done. Here is an update as it relates to the legislative activity in particular. Of course, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Louisiana, as I mentioned, all got legislation signed in 2021. And these are all the states that are either working on legislation now or already have a bill in. So we're going to see a lot of activity in 2022. Prior to 2021, the most states that we ever had pass TID legislation is one. And we had 3 in 2021. And I think we're going to beat that record in 2022. So I know there's a lot of folks out there that are really doing some great work. And this is adding a new, very stable, dedicated source of funding to our tool as another tool in our toolkit, as something else that's available to DMOs to provide increased supplemental stable funding. Well, one of the things when we first started this 25 years ago, we certainly didn't envision of where this might go. And some of the things that we're seeing now that I wanted to highlight for folks and that we highlight in the report is dedicated funding for sports tourism. Really a terrific generator of business within our communities. It's a great way to add to that community engagement. I want to say thank you to Roxanne Steinhoff on our team, who did a great job at Sports ETA just last week, talking about using this dedicated funding model to fund sports kinds of activities. We're seeing more and more of that all the time. The other topic I really wanted to highlight is the use of these funds for capital improvements. We certainly didn't envision that 20 years ago, but we are starting to see more and more folks say this is a great tool we can use for capital improvements. And the two biggest driving factors here to use that as opposed to a bed tax increase or another tax increase is usually putting something like this in place takes the support of the payers and not the support of the electorate. That's a big difference. And so if you have your payer community, your lodging, and if you extend it into other aspects of the hospitality community. If your payers are supportive, generally speaking, you can get a district like this put together. And second, oftentimes when you're funding capital improvements, there are additional revenues that are left over as part of that process, right? As part of a bonding process, you've got to have reserves, you've got to have a high level of coverage. So those funds typically would be spun off into other city projects. If you use a TID mechanism, we usually set up a waterfall so that that money falls back to the DMO at the end of that project. A couple of highlights of districts that have used TIDs to fund capital improvements. Placer Valley in Northern California used this to fund a 19,000 square foot event center. It has had a tremendous boost to their destination, and you can imagine through COVID how much that has helped them. They've also used the money to upgrade their aquatic center, as well as building some sand volleyball courts at the local college. Sacramento used this money to add a ballroom onto their convention center expansion. They had an existing TID in place. They laid a TID over the top of it. The hotels drove this effort and said, we want to add another 1% on, adding a little over $3 million a year and adding $52 million to the kitty. That was the proceeds from the bonding that they used to build the 50,000 square foot ballroom that just opened in Sacramento. Finally, I wanted to talk about sales tax increment financing. And for those of you that are familiar with tax increment financing, been around for 50 or 60 years, normally in the property tax arena in downtowns, essentially taking growth in property tax and reinvesting that in capital improvements in their downtowns. This has been a very successful tool for downtown revitalization. Well, this is a tool that has been adopted in a slightly different form in the tourism industry, and that is to look at sales tax, not property tax, and say, if we could drive more sales tax revenue, maybe we could convince our government partners to say some of that growth in sales tax should be invested back into our industry. And that's exactly what sales tax increment financing is, essentially taking the growth in sales tax and saying, we want to put it back in our industry. A couple of the advantages with this kind of funding stream is you're not raising taxes on anybody. You're just redirecting future growth, number one. And number two, it's a very broad-based a levy. When you're talking about sales tax on all the various different kinds of tourism businesses, we're getting away from just hotels. Now we're talking about lots of other businesses, restaurants businesses, attraction businesses, maybe even transportation businesses that would be essentially helping contribute into this fund that would help pay for it. This was a model that was first pioneered in Missouri, and you can see here I've listed 5 state travel offices. Utah has had great success with their performance fund there, funding their state travel efforts, and actually a re-granting program out to some of the local DMOs. Maryland, I mentioned Missouri, Mississippi just recently adopted a model like this, and Ohio had a model like this, but they were capped at 10 million. And so basically have just followed on with the $10 million investment as opposed to the sales tax increment financing mechanism. So I now will turn it over to Chris Adams.
Thanks a lot, John. And just a reminder, the Q&A is available, so hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to address questions. We've got a couple already there. Of course, we've already noted the slides that will include the specific breakout of the research that Erin was sharing, plus the full report, plus the recording, and other resources will be shared out via an email tomorrow. We'll be launching the report and the related web page. So I want to talk about sustainability and regenerative tourism. So a key theme of COVID-19, both in terms of the recovery money and the sort of consensus coming out of this crisis, has been the concept of building back better. I just really wanted to highlight 4 ways in which DMOs can take more of a leadership role in this area, and the extent to which funding and some specific funding mechanisms, including using tourism taxation and levies, etc., can be a critical part of supporting and sponsoring that. So in terms of the first area, sustainable marketing. So this is really just a natural extension of the marketing and communications roles that DMOs have already been doing. It's come up in a number of funding areas. I'm going to talk in a moment about Durango, where 52% of their increase in lodging tax was related to sustainable marketing. So that's messaging around responsible visitor behavior, such as the work that Colorado Tourism Office did with their Care for Colorado program, making sure visitors interact in ways that is responsible and minimize their impact. Google has just made an enormous commitment to sustainable marketing and communications. They've got a team of 40 plus data scientists, engineers working on surfacing and highlighting information around sustainability, environmental programs, and other ways in which businesses and providers in the tourism industry are recording and minimizing their impact on the environment. So this is their new sustainability criteria under their hotel section. They've got over 72 different criteria that are listing and highlighting information on all the various ways in which hotels are making a commitment. So this is managed and controlled by the hotel. It is sort of checked and verified by Google, but this is a powerful way that DMOs can just extend their own information, both in terms of looking at some of this information to add to your DMO website, as well as obviously working with them, the industry on major platforms like Google. And of course, Miles has been working over the last several years through our Google DMO partnership program services in terms of empowering DMOs and industry to use these sorts of platforms. I also wanted to highlight the opportunity to use what we're calling outcome-based pricing in tourism taxation, visitor fees, etc. So this can be a really powerful way if you restructure how those fees or tourism taxations are applied. That could be a powerful market signal to encourage the types of visitation you want and discourage the types of visitation you don't want. So for example, Croatia has differential bed taxes, which is higher in the peak season, lower in the off season. They also have differential fees for coaches traveling through Croatia. If you're just driving through for the day or coming for just one night, you pay substantially more than if you're there for a longer period of time. Amsterdam is another example, and there's a variety of other European examples who are using differential taxes and fees. The major airport, Keflavik Airport in Iceland, has used this sort of outcome-based pricing in terms of their flight fees and association passenger levies to encourage both year-round service and substantially encourage airlines to service in the shoulder and off-season. And they've done a remarkable job in terms of building year-round visitation to a destination that you wouldn't typically think of as traveling to in the winter, for example. So differential pricing, it's not widely used, but certainly have a look at the opportunity to use that and use market signals to help encourage and discourage the sorts of travel we want to see in our communities. We're seeing across the United States and around the world increasing pressures around some significant issues that are impacted and influenced by tourism. Affordable housing and workforce issues are one major area. So Glenwood Springs, for example, is looking at taking some of the lodging tax and applying it specifically to workforce housing. There's quite a number of other destinations in a similar space in terms of looking at the specific roles in which tourism funding can help address some of these community issues. I mentioned Durango before. They just saw a 45% increase in their lodging tax. I mentioned just over half went into sustainable tourism, but a further 14% is going into arts and culture and around 20% into public transit. So those are specific ways in which lodging increase was passed, and it was not only around tourism marketing, but some of these other broader community benefits that can help drive community support, improve social license, and really create a sense that tourism is making a specific difference. One of the most significant transitions we're going to see over the next decade is the move towards electric vehicles, which is already well underway. There's already substantial funding in this space available. The likes of Oregon with their electric byways, and more recently Colorado, have been active in this space. And this is one specific area that DMOs could be actively involved in terms of helping identify where electric charging stations could be added to ensure that there's dispersal of visitors, that they can get out to those lesser known regions or neighborhoods in your destination. Identifying small local businesses where perhaps charging stations could help support and provide a reason to stop for visitors with small locally owned businesses, and really helping sort of shape what is going to be a radical transformation of our transport. There's enormous amounts of money already flowing through the system, and if the infrastructure bill passes here in the coming weeks, there'll be even more in this space. Thinking about regenerative tourism. So regenerative tourism isn't just mitigating or minimizing or managing the impacts of tourism. It's trying to make a positive difference and improvement either in the community and or environment. There's now an increasing number of destinations around the world, such as my home country, New Zealand, which has levies specifically targeted towards conservation funds to reinvest into species protection, natural areas restoration, etc. Iceland's another example of this. But I wanted to, in particular, call out the innovative work done in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. They instituted a short-term rental tax that was used to deal with wastewater, obviously exacerbated by short-term rentals. It contributed not only to the wastewater infrastructure, but part of the wastewater, the final sort of treatment stage, was a wetlands restoration funding project. So not only dealt with an infrastructure issue, but made a consciously positive difference to the natural environment and helps mitigate some of the sort of carbon footprint issues in destinations. And this whole concept of what's called natural carbon solutions, or NCS, it's going to be a major theme of what's going on in Glasgow right at the moment. And a major report was just issued identifying that, in fact, 40% plus of minimizing the carbon in many parts of the world, many destinations, can be dealt with through wetlands restoration and protection, reforestation programs, etc. Sort of both improving the natural environment, what's called secondary benefits, as well as mitigating and improving your carbon footprint situation. I just wanted to highlight on late next week, November the 11th, we're going to be issuing a thought leadership piece, what's called 26 for COP26. Obviously, Glasgow, the 26th iteration of climate change negotiations. And hopefully this will provide 26 specific concrete ways in which destinations can look at minimizing your carbon footprint, and what are some of the funding mechanisms to help with that. We're working with our very good friends, not only at Civitas, but Group Now and GDSM in Europe. So we've summarized in our Funding for Tomorrow piece, that was the Major Transatlantic report we issued late last year. We ran a webinar. Here's some of the sort of 5 of the 10 best practices we identified. Obviously, if you're going to get into sustainability and regenerative tourism, you need a destination master plan, which is holistic, that looks more broadly at tourism as part of a broader community and environment with specific defined goals. You need funding and resources to make this happen, and ideally that is dedicated and specific, and there's a number of TIDs and other funding mechanisms that are specifically funding these sorts of efforts. Have a think about outcome-based pricing so we can use our market mechanisms to help encourage the right sort of travel and tourism growth. And the best regions have got full and transparent reporting, not only on what they're trying to achieve, but on their progress, what's working, what isn't working, as well as an inclusive and more broadly based governance structure, which includes not just industry, but residents and other key community groups. So those are a few key takeaways in terms of the sustainability. I just wanted to wrap up with 6 reminders from the session today, and then I'll invite John, Adam, and Erin to join me for just the final few minutes. So we talked about recovery funding. Obviously, the start around that is understanding what funding is flowing through the system, who are the key decision makers, and make sure you're at the table in terms of with a plan on how and where you can spend that money. A key issue in terms of understanding funding legislation, particularly, for example, with tourism improvement districts, is there an enabling legislation already moving through your state? And or can you be part of making that happen? So create a positive legislative environment that will give you choices and options in your destination. Have a think about some of the critical risk mitigation issues, particularly reserve funds. Are you moving boldly and assertively enough in that area? Make sure you're in touch with your residents, industry, and political sentiment. A lot of the issues we're seeing around the United States, Canada, elsewhere in the world, in terms of pressures on funding being reduced or siphoned off for other purposes, is often because there's issues emerging in the community or elsewhere that were not well understood by the destination marketing or management organization. If you don't have a destination master plan or sustainable tourism plan, it's a great time to think about creating one or updating one. And as John highlighted, there's a huge variety of contestable EDA funds, $240 million. And as he identified, they love funding these sorts of strategy projects. And then finally, we want to move from obviously aspiration to action. So be clear, have a clear short and medium and long-term set of specific actions that you want to try and achieve. Okay, just in the final couple of minutes, I'll come to the questions. Just a reminder that that webpage and the report will be launched tomorrow. Everybody will get an email. And we had a question, John, in terms of regional TIDs. So Teddy was specifically asking, I think in addition, obviously there's statewide TIDs, there's TIDs in cities. Are there any counties or cities or other regions working together on tourism improvement districts?
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head, Chris. There is a statewide TID in California that funds Visit California at $120 million a year. There are regional TIDs. We see that on the county level. We see it is sometimes multiple counties. There are districts that have multiple counties. Certainly there are some that have multiple cities, like the district in Boston that Martha Sheridan just did included both Boston and Cambridge. So it really is a question of what is your destination? What are the appropriate boundaries for your destination? And most folks try to make their TID boundaries fit with where most others would think this is the natural sort of boundary line for our destination as a whole.
Very good. And just a follow-up question here about assessments on more than lodging. Obviously, I think California is an example of that they assess more than lodging. Any quick comment on that?
It is. It's very difficult to do, but we have seen several do it successfully. California's statewide assessment includes not only lodging, but also restaurants, retail, attractions, transportation. They're all in there. We've worked on a district in Mammoth, John Erdy's district there, did very successfully, included restaurants, retail, and attractions in that district. And one just recently in North Lake Tahoe also included all those other stakeholders as well. It's very challenging, not easy to do, but there are folks that are out there that are doing it, that are trying to make it much more broad-based and tap into some of those industries that haven't historically invested in tourism, but sometimes now are willing to step up and say, yes, we'll be a part of it.
Great. And just in the final couple of minutes, Adam and Erin, international recovery, any comments about the speed and velocity that you see international tourism coming back, particularly for the destinations that was previously a really important part of their visitor mix? Adam, perhaps first.
Well, most major market borders are going to open on November 8th. And this is, of course, a game changer. I think it's realistic to expect next year, think about international at around 2/3 of 2019 levels. It's going to take time because air service isn't going to come right back across all routes. It's not going to be as frequent. There's also going to be some ongoing reluctance as well, but we're going to get back a lot. I mean, think about, this year, probably down for the year, roughly 80% on international. So the fact that we're going to be down perhaps just a third next year, we'll take that as a big improvement. We don't think we get fully back on international until 2024, until volumes. And there are a number of reasons for that. There's certain markets that we think are going to be especially slow to come back out of Asia. We also think that China is a bit of a different kind of market than it was before this due to a number of issues, both economic and political. But international, of course, becomes very, very important again in 2022, a key part of marketing strategy and planning.
Yeah, and Aaron, I know you survey international markets. They're keen to return when that's possible.
They certainly are. From what we're seeing on what consumers are expressing, the demand is certainly there, and it'll be led in the U.S. by people who have been to the U.S. previously.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, John, Adam, Aaron, for your wonderful contributions today. Thank you for everybody who attended. Call out there that the research, the resources from today will be available tomorrow. You'll get an email, and we'll look forward to connecting with you soon. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.